Welcome everyone to episode 52 of The Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. I'm back with another episode of the Delisted series, and as you can see from the thumbnail to this video, I was pouring out just a little bit of liquor for two of my dead homies, this being Battlefield Bad Company 1, which came out in June of 2008, and Battlefield Bad Company 2, the sequel, which came out in March 2010. Both of these games came out in the 7th gen for the PS3 and Xbox 360, but then the sequel also got a PC release in addition to mobile releases down the road. But now, these two beloved titles were delisted from online storefronts on April 28th, 2023. So if you did not purchase these before the deadline, you can no longer get access to them on a digital front, so you have to rely on the physical copies. And especially if you're a PC player and are looking for completion, you're only going to get the second game because the first Bad Company only came out on consoles. And these aren't the only two games that got delisted back in April. Also, Battlefield 1943, which was digital and online only, got the axe as well. Now, both Bad Company games have online components, and those servers are still running to this day, but also have a deadline of December the 8th of 2023. That is when the servers for all three of the games I just mentioned are going to be sunset, and from then on, Battlefield 1943 will be unplayable, and then the two Bad Company games will only have the single-player campaigns intact. So if you are an owner of any of these three games and are looking for a bit of nostalgia and to get into the fray one last time, my advice to you would be, we don't know exactly what time the servers are going to get shut down on December the 8th. So I would say if you're looking for maybe a final party and maybe a final blasting of your guns to salute this wonderful but incomplete franchise, December 7th is probably going to be your best bet to do one last fray in this game. But let's get into these games and why they're so special. And I'm going to admit, I am completely new to the Bad Company series. I missed out on these games back in the day when they first came out in the 7th gen because this was in the middle of the heated Call of Duty versus Battlefield rivalry, and I was a huge Call of Duty head back then. I was playing Modern Warfare 1 and 2, Black Ops like crazy, and Battlefield by comparison just felt a little clunkier, a little too overwhelming, and by that point, even though I didn't realize it because I still wasn't really wise to why frame rate was important back then, I was still kind of new to that concept, to be playing Call of Duty at 60 frames and then to go back to 30 frames on Bad Company was a step back in my opinion, and it just didn't fly. So I missed out on both games back in the day, but over the years, I kept hearing from different people I respected over and over how great and endearing these games were, and they always piqued my curiosity. So when I found out that the games have been delisted, I told myself, okay, well, these games I find all the time in bargain bins, pawn shops, used game stores. They're dirt cheap. This would be the best time to grab them. And out in the wild, you can still get these games pretty cheap, and we'll get into that later. But if you're going on eBay, it's kind of a different story. So my advice is if you're a collector and looking to save some money and you want to preserve these games, better to get them now while they're in the bargain bin than later. Okay, so we've gone over the delisting, what you can still play, what's going to be shut down. If you've never actually played the Battlefield Bad Company series, let's get into each of the two games briefly to see if this is something that you feel is warranted to include on your collecting shelf. So the first Bad Company, again, came out in June of 2008. And what's funny about both of the Bad Company games is that they both came out in the shadow of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1 and 2, respectively, because Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare came out only a few months before Battlefield Bad Company 1. Obviously, if you remember and were alive and well at that time, Call of Duty Modern Warfare was the rage. Everybody was playing it, so you have Battlefield Bad Company coming out in the shadow of that behemoth, And it was interesting because Bad Company 1 was very experimental and took a lot of risks. Number one, Battlefield itself, even though it had already existed on consoles, was primarily a PC kind of animal. It was about a big sandbox with huge battles, different classes and vehicles, and what they were trying to do is bring this into a console territory, but retain that Battlefield spirit with an added campaign and some characters. So briefly, without spoiling too much, you play as Private Preston Marlowe, who has now joined the B Company, the 222nd Army Battalion of the U.S. Army, known as the Bad Company. And essentially, this is a place for all the misfits and miscreants to get pushed away to become cannon fodder in this future fictional war between the United States and the Russian Federation, set against the backdrop of this fictional country, Sardaristan. You join Sergeant Samuel Redford and Privates Terrence Sweetwater and my personal favorite, Private George Gordon Haggard, this ragtag band of miscreants, as you basically run orders for the U.S. Army in this fight against the Russians. But then, along the way, you decide to go AWOL when you discover that these mercenaries, the Legionnaires, are hoarding gold bars, and you decide with your troop that this might be more beneficial to your future retirement plans than, say, joining this endless war. So, overall, the story isn't super deep. It's really about the interaction between the characters that's really endearing here, in addition to the fact that you can just blow everything up. Battlefield Bad Company 1 was DICE, the developers, introduction of the Frostbite engine, which allowed for destructibility of up to like 90% of the buildings and the terrain, which makes battle really open-ended, sandbox-esque, and allows for a lot of different decision-making and just fun. The fact that you can just blow the crap out of your enemies out of their hiding spots never gets old. But because there's so much going on screen, and I think because perhaps DICE hadn't had a lot of experience with these consoles yet, unfortunately, there are a lot of frame rate issues, especially in the campaign where it sometimes struggles to maintain 30 frames a second. There's a lot of screen tearing and unfortunately a lot of very spotty collision detection. So overall, this game is not perfect. It feels a little buggy, but the fact that it's very open-ended allows you to do your thing on your own a lot of the time. And again, the destructibility and the humor of the characters interacting keep you glued to this campaign for about its 6 to 7 hour length. So overall, it's a lot of fun, isn't super deep, but will keep you entertained. And like I said, there is still a multiplayer function that you can get into, whether it's Rush or Conquest, although I'll find right now you can still jump into online on the first game, albeit there aren't a lot of people still playing it, and you'll most likely get launched into the Rush feature, but it is still available there. After that, you also have the sequel, Battlefield Bad Company 2, which came out in March 2010, again, in the shadow of a Modern Warfare game from Call of Duty, this time Modern Warfare 2, which had just come out a few months prior. So this was DICE's answer to that. And I'm going to tell you right now, Battlefield Bad Company 2, once you finish the campaign for the first one, the second campaign is going to feel like such a breath of fresh air. Technically, artistically, it is just so much better in so many ways. The controls are better, the sensitivity is better, the graphics are better, the comedy is funnier, the story is deeper and even a little bit darker and less superficial. They fixed so many things with the campaign, and even though it retains that sandbox spirit of the first game, you can tell they were trying to compete with Call of Duty more in the second game, where there are a lot more set pieces, a bit more linearity, and just it feels bigger. So overall, it's a lot more enjoyable to play. I feel the characters in the Bad Company unit fleshed out and developed a lot more, and you care about them a lot more in this game, and you really want to see where they go next as characters. But again, going back to why I was pouring out a little liquor on the thumbnail for this video, because I am heartbroken. This game unlike the first game where it kind of ends kind of funny and wraps itself up reasonably, the second game ends on such a brutal cliffhanger. It's requiring a sequel to wrap up its story ends, but here we are sitting 13 years later and we still do not have the fabled Battlefield Bad Company 3, which DICE said years ago was being considered, was not in active development, but it's this thing where it seems like they've been sitting on the fence for a long time about this game, because even the producer of the first game and one of the designers on the second game, it was Carl Magnus Trodson. He actually remarked a few years back that he didn't understand why fans love this series so much. And I can see that might have just been an excuse, perhaps. But if you want to look at the wider picture, if people are still wondering why this game isn't coming out, take a look at what's going on in the world, okay? So you're talking about a future conflict between Russia and the States and this invasion of Alaska and this potential nuclear war. Well, hello, what's going on in the world right now? You've got tense relationships between Russia and the US. You've got this conflict between Russia and Ukraine that has no end. I would say that to take the chance of putting out a Battlefield Bad Company 3 plotline centered around a fictional Russian-American war probably wouldn't sit well right now and might almost be seen as a provocation on the part of EA and DICE. So I can see why the series is sitting on ice right now and they've kind of painted themselves into a corner, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that over time we will give these games another life in our culture by having a remaster of the first two games, which they so deservedly require, in addition to finally just giving us what we want. The finale to this trilogy. Let's just see the happy endings we want to see for these characters. I want to see Samuel Redford go retire and go fishing. I want to see Terrence Sweetwater marry his radio girl. I want to see Haggard go find his Dallas Cowboy cheerleader and Preston Marlowe just be the hero he is. I love these characters. So my answer to DICE is yes. This is why we want Battlefield Bad Company 3. Who cares if Call of Duty is the behemoth? We want these characters back. We want that destructibility back. We want to be able to blow the crap out of trees and buildings and tanks and fly planes. This is what we want. And even though the games were flawed, especially the second game, has a lot of cheap deaths, has some brutal save traps to it, you know what I'm talking about, the games are just like the Bad Company themselves. They're a little rough around the edges, a little bit misfit, but they have a good heart, and there's something really endearing about them. So let's take the last part of this video and talk about where the physical copies are standing in terms of price, value, and where I feel they're going in the future. So here we are at pricecharting.com taking a look at the differences first between Battlefield Bad Company 1 for the PS3 versus the Xbox 360 since release. We're looking at the pricing history, and you can see that they both follow a fairly similar trajectory. Here, the PlayStation version is represented by the blue line, whereas the 360 version is the gold line. And in most cases, the PS3 version prevails, but I would say that in terms of their overall future value, as with the second one, it's really going to come down to whether you prefer nostalgia for your experience on the PS3 I'm referring to, or whether you prefer convenience with regards to the Xbox version. Let me explain. Even though both versions are fairly similar, and I have to make a point of this because there is a lot of lore around the 7th generation, specifically with third-party games around the early part of that gen. Often, the Xbox 360 versions were superior to the PlayStation 3 versions because of the hardware on the PlayStation being very tricky to program for and notorious. I'm thinking of Skyrim, Orange Box, whereas the Battlefield Bad Company games, both 1 and 2, I watched some comparison videos and they perform almost identically. So whether you decide to play on either console, you're going to get a similar experience. But reality is that a lot of time has passed since these games came out. if you want to play the PS3 versions, you are limited to playing these on old hardware. That means you have to have a working PS3. You're going to have to break that out of storage, put that on, and also you're going to have to make sure you have a working DualShock 3. And I don't know if you've been shopping for DualShock 3 first-party controllers, but they are becoming very difficult to find, and they break down easily, and those knockoffs they're fine. Let's put it that way. Whereas, if you have an Xbox One or an Xbox Series X, both Battlefield Bad Company 1 and 2 are backwards compatible. Now, you're not going to get any boost in frame rate or resolution, but in terms of convenience, you have the option to play both of these on modern hardware with a modern controller. So overall, I'd say in terms of playing the game in 2023, if you've got the Xbox version, that's probably the best way to go. But that said, going back to my argument about both of these holding relative value in comparison to each other in the future, while the Xbox version is more convenient, there is something nostalgic about plugging your PS3, jumping on, using that old hardware, and even jumping into an online match this day that just takes you back to a different time. So that's the first game. You see, in terms of the prices, still under 10 US for both. If you go out in the wild, you can find both these games dirt cheap right now. So if you want to add these to your library, this is the best time to do it before time passes and they go up in value as nostalgia gets deeper and deeper and deeper for these games. So now, quickly, let's revert over to the second game and look at not only the comparisons between the console versions on PS3 and Xbox 360, but whereas the blue line is for PlayStation 3, gold line is for Xbox 360, but then you also have an added red line here for the PC version. And as you can see, that is currently the most valuable version, with the Xbox 360 taking second place. I would say probably because of its backwards compatibility features, and then the PS3 just slightly below that. So, like the first game, under $10 US, still widely available, but if you go onto eBay, you will start to see these games climb a little bit more than what you'd grab them out for in the wild. So my advice is, if you pass a used game store or a bargain bin, grab them now sooner than later. So this is the best time to grab these heralded games that have so much endearing qualities. And again, I can't stress this enough, that we need to see a Battlefield Bad Company 3. We need to see the end of the story, but based on current world events, probably unlikely, at least for the near future. And that about wraps it up. So thank you for watching the 52nd episode of The Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Later, Game Chasers, and peace.